You are completely useless. A pathetic excuse for a man. I cannot stand you. I will lock you up and nothing will happen.
She slapped him right there in front of the school gate. Not just any man. A stranger she believed had disrespected her, embarrassed her, provoked her in public. Students watched. Okada riders stopped. Parents turned their heads. Her palm echoed louder than her anger, louder than her pride. She thought she was defending her dignity. She thought she was teaching a lesson to a man who didn't know who she was. What she didn't know was that she had just struck the one person who held her future in his hands. He wasn't just a passerby. He wasn't just another man on the street. He was her lecturer, the lecturer who had quietly taken interest in her brilliance, and the lecturer who now stood frozen, shocked, and humiliated. Now she is not just a student. She is a young woman standing on the edge of consequences she never imagined. Her academics, her reputation, her future, all trembling under the weight of one moment of anger. Because the slap was loud, but what comes after will be louder. Welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We'll be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you are watching from. The slap cracked through the morning air like a broken bottle hitting concrete, slicing straight through the noise of students laughing, cars honking, and Okadas buzzing at the school gate. Everything stopped. Movement froze. Even the sunlight felt paused against the dusty signboard shaking in the breeze. She stood there, hand still raised, chest still rising from anger she thought was justified, heart still pounding with a pride she believed was strength. But the silence that followed wrapped around her like a warning, cold, heavy, and waiting to swallow her whole. Whatever she expected next, it was not this stillness. Students at the gate slowly turned, their eyes widening as if someone had flipped the world upside down. A mother picking up her child stopped mid-sentence. Okada riders froze with helmets half raised, and the school security guard stepped out, unsure whether to intervene or stay back. The air shifted, thick, judging, stretched tight like rubber about to snap. She felt all those stares digging into her skin, reminding her that she hadn't just reacted, she had performed. And in that instant of stillness, she sensed something moving beneath the surface, something about to rise and redefine everything she thought she controlled. The man she slapped didn't stagger. He didn't flare up. He simply lifted his face slowly, the imprint of her palm glowing faintly against his cheek. His eyes were calm in a way that made her breath hitch, calm in a way that said this was no ordinary man touched in anger. His quietness felt louder than any shout she had ever heard. She expected outrage, insult, or a return slap, but instead she got a silence that held weight. And in that silence, something inside her trembled, not from fear, but from the sense that she had touched the wrong person. Whispers rippled through the students like wind through dry leaves. Phones rose into the air, screens glowing, lenses watching her with a hunger she could feel crawling along her spine. Someone gasped. Someone chuckled. Someone whispered her name with sharp excitement. In a heartbeat, she was no longer a girl defending herself. She was a spectacle, a trending topic waiting to happen. Faces blurred together into a wall of judgment she could not outrun. And as the first camera zoomed in, she realized that the slap had already left her hand, but the consequences were still rushing toward her. Heat crawled up her neck as she lowered her hand, her fingers trembling slightly as adrenaline melted into something colder and heavier. She replayed the moment in her mind. His foot stepping too close, his shoulder brushing hers, the tone she thought was disrespect. Everything had felt explosive then, but now, standing frozen in the crowd's stare, she wasn't sure anymore. Maybe she had misread him. Maybe she had reacted too quickly. Pride pushed the thought away, but doubt squeezed through the cracks. And that doubt whispered something terrifying. What if he was not the man she thought he was? The man straightened his shirt with a calmness that stung more than any insult he could have thrown. He adjusted his glasses with slow precision, eyes never leaving hers, and the measured way he breathed made her chest tighten. Nothing about him matched the random stranger she believed she slapped. His posture carried authority. His silence carried restraint. His gaze carried a message she could not interpret. And as he shifted slightly to the side, she saw the staff ID tag tucked under his notebook. Just a flash, just a moment, yet enough to send a cold shock through her entire body. Her heartbeat slammed into her ribs as the truth clicked like a lock snapping shut. The ID, the posture, the silence. Everything aligned in a way that made the ground beneath her feet feel unstable. She felt the color drain from her face as the realization settled. A quick, sharp, unforgiving truth she wished she could unsee. The man she slapped wasn't a stranger. He wasn't an outsider. He wasn't someone she could simply walk away from. He belonged here. He belonged to the system that held her future. And as he finally turned toward the gate, she knew this was only the beginning. He turned fully now, the morning sun striking his face in a clean, unforgiving line, revealing every quiet detail she had ignored in her anger. His expression wasn't twisted in pain or shock. It was composed, almost unnervingly controlled. His jaw tightened just enough to show restraint, not rage. His eyes, steady and unreadable, carried a depth that made her stomach sink. This wasn't the face of a man picked out of random frustration. This was the face of someone who understood power, patience, and consequence. And seeing it clearly, she felt something sharp pierce through the armor of her pride. He adjusted his glasses with slow precision, and the movement drew her eyes down again to that ID card half hidden beneath his notebook. A polished clip glinted. A school emblem she had seen on office doors flashed. Her breath caught. Her mind raced. She wanted to look away, but the truth forced her gaze to stay. Everything about him, his composure, his silence, the subtle authority in his stance, now made sense in a way that punched through her chest. She hadn't slapped a random man. She had slapped someone who was trained to evaluate people like her. A fresh wave of heat burned its way across her cheeks as the crowd pressed closer, whispering louder now that they sensed something bigger unfolding. She felt naked under their eyes, stripped of the confidence that had fueled her a moment ago. Every second dragged like a punishment as she watched him exhale slowly, the rise of his chest steady, deliberate. He wasn't avoiding her stare anymore. He was dissecting it. And in that stillness, she felt the weight of being seen, not as the fierce girl who stood her ground, but as someone who had crossed a line she couldn't erase. He finally moved, but not toward her. He stepped past her with the controlled grace of someone used to holding authority, each stride quiet, yet heavy with meaning. Students parted instinctively, creating space for him without thinking. Even the security guard stepped aside, as if recognizing something she had missed. His presence commanded respect in a way she never noticed before, because she never had reason to. Watching him walk away, she felt her heart stumble, because power didn't always shout. Sometimes it walked quietly, and that quiet could destroy or protect, depending on whose hand it responded to. Her knees softened slightly as the truth settled deeper, an unwelcome guest taking its seat inside her chest. She replayed the last 30 seconds in her mind. Every step, every breath, every slow turn of his head, and the realization sharpened with each memory. She had struck a man who held not just knowledge, but influence. A man who could shape futures with a stroke of a pen. A man whose voice carried weight in offices she had never stepped into. And now his silence felt like a blade suspended above her, waiting for the slightest movement to determine its direction. The whispers grew harsher. Some students pointed at the ID card. Others gasped as the information traveled from person to person like a spark leaping between dry leaves. Her name spread through the murmurs, sometimes whispered with shock, sometimes with satisfaction. Someone recorded, zooming in on her face, capturing the crack in her confidence. She felt trapped in the center of a tightening circle, every expression around her carrying judgment. And as her eyes followed the lecturer disappearing into the school compound, A cold truth tightened around her throat. Everyone now knew she had slapped someone untouchable. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as the weight of her mistake pressed down, heavier than any punishment she had received in her life. He didn't look back. Not once. That scared her more than any confrontation. His silence was a storm gathering quietly behind the clouds, waiting for the right moment to break open. She took a shaky step back, realizing that she hadn't just bruised someone's face. She had bruised her own future. And as she turned toward the school entrance, her heart pounded with a single dreadful question. What happens when he decides to act? Phones lifted like a forest of metallic branches, their lenses catching the sunlight as they aimed directly at her trembling frame. Someone pressed record with the excitement of witnessing chaos unfold. Her face, still hot from anger and embarrassment, was now frozen on countless screens. The gate buzzed with restless energy, every person turning into a broadcaster of her downfall. She tried to shrink into herself, but shame had already climbed her shoulders. And as the first video rapidly hit multiple WhatsApp class groups, she felt the world tilt, reminding her that disgrace always travels faster than truth. Whispers slithered through the crowd like quick-moving shadows, attaching themselves to her name. Students laughed in hushed tones, some shocked, others entertained. Parents lowered their voices, but didn't bother to hide their judgment. Someone muttered a twisted version of what they saw, adding spice to make the story hotter. She could almost hear her reputation cracking under the weight of exaggerations. Every whisper carried a different version of her. The troublemaker, the arrogant girl, the disrespectful student. And as the noise grew louder, she realized shame didn't need truth. It only needed an audience willing to believe anything. The video spread with frightening speed. First to group chats, then to departmental forums, then to students who weren't even on campus yet. Short clips, screenshots, and memes started forming like wild rumors. Her raised hand became a freeze frame. The lecturer's calm face became another. Even before the truth could catch up, people were already choosing sides, rewriting events, and making judgments she had no power to control. She watched someone replay the clip, zooming in on her expression as if searching for proof of wickedness. And that was when she realized she was no longer a person, she was content. Her heart raced as she caught fragments of conversations drifting around her. Some mocked her courage. Others dismissed her as unstable. A few pretended to defend her, but still shared the video anyway. Every word cut deeper than the last. She had always believed she could handle public attention until she was on the wrong side of it. The shame crawled up her neck, wrapping around her chest with a tightness that made breathing difficult. She felt like sinking into the ground, disappearing, erasing herself from the scene. But the cameras stayed on her, refusing to let her escape. She turned away from the crowd, hoping to slip through the gate unnoticed, but the students parted in a way that felt deliberate, giving her space not out of respect, but out of a desire to watch her walk through a corridor of judgment. She could feel their eyes burning against her back like small fires. Someone played the recording aloud, the slap echoing sharply again, making her flinch. With every step, she felt the shame stretch longer behind her, like a shadow she could never outrun. And the more she moved forward, the more the whispers followed. A sudden hush swept over the students when someone pointed toward the faculty building where the lecturer had entered. His silhouette appeared briefly on the balcony, speaking to another staff member who looked stunned as he explained something. She watched from below, her breath caught, her heart twisting. She didn't know what he was saying. She didn't know how he was framing the story. His calmness earlier had felt like mercy, but now it felt like a shield she couldn't see through. And the possibility that he was speaking about her left her knees dangerously weak. A notification beep from someone's phone cut through the crowd, followed by a gasp. A message had just dropped on the school's general platform. Urgent faculty meeting in 10 minutes. The timing was too sharp to be a coincidence. Her chest tightened, dread consuming her like cold water spilling inside her lungs. She stared up at the balcony again, watching the lecturer disappear into the hallway. Whatever decisions were being made behind those walls would soon reach her. And as the whispers grew into full-blown speculation, she felt the unavoidable truth closing in. Her real punishment hadn't even begun. Inside the faculty building, the air felt colder than outside, the kind of cold that came not from air conditioners, but from the weight of serious conversations. Lecturers filed into the staff room, their shoes tapping against the tiles like small hammers of judgment. Papers rustled, chairs shifted, and murmurs floated through the space, low, clipped, and pointed. Her name slipped through those murmurs with a sharpness that stung even in her absence. Every lecturer had an opinion already, every whisper adding another layer to the story. And the weight of that story was beginning to gather momentum. The lecturer she slapped stood near the staff table, carefully placing his notebook beside a pile of exam scripts. His calm posture drew quick glances from colleagues, some sympathetic, some curious, others quietly judgmental. A senior lecturer leaned closer, asking what happened, and though he kept his voice low, the entire room leaned in like they were listening for a verdict. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't defend himself. He just explained the incident with a calm that sounded almost too controlled. And that restraint made the situation feel even more dangerous, because silence in the right place becomes authority. The dean entered the room with a seriousness that shifted the entire atmosphere. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, pens froze in hands, and everyone sat straighter. The dean scanned the faces, then spoke in a tone that carried both disappointment and curiosity. He mentioned her name. Not angrily, but with the heavy clarity of someone announcing a matter that had already crossed administrative boundaries. Some lecturers sighed. Some clicked their tongues. Some nodded as if they saw this coming. And in that single moment, she became more than a girl who made a mistake. She became a case being prepared for judgment. Opinions flowed freely once the dean left. One lecturer shook his head, calling it a sign of moral decay. Another insisted she had always been too proud. A third, who once praised her academic brilliance, now looked disappointed as if she had personally betrayed him. Everyone suddenly remembered a moment, a rumor, a complaint they had brushed aside before. Her identity stretched into every corner of the room, her past magnified, her flaws amplified. She wasn't there to defend herself, yet every sentence spoken about her felt like another nail quietly hammered into her reputation. Through all the noise, the lecturer she slapped remained still. His hands rested gently on the table, his eyes focused on the floor as if weighing something only he understood. His silence was no longer calm, it was decisive. It forced everyone else to lower their voices, to wonder what he planned. It made the room pay attention. People expected him to lash out, to demand punishment, to make an example of her. But he didn't. And that refusal to act became more intimidating than any outburst. Silence from a wounded leader always means the storm hasn't chosen where to break yet. An administrative officer entered the room holding a clipboard filled with complaint procedures. She whispered something to the lecturer, slid a form toward him, and waited. He didn't pick it up immediately. Instead, he stared at it for a long, thoughtful moment. The room watched closely, too closely. Some leaned forward, eager for drama, others tense with concern. He finally touched the paper but didn't sign it. The officer nodded, understanding, and explained the next steps quietly. The process had begun. Whether he formally accused her or not, the system was already pulling her name into its gears. As the meeting ended, the lecturer tucked the unsigned form into his notebook and walked out slowly, leaving a trail of curiosity behind him. No one knew what he would do. No one knew whether he intended mercy or justice. But everyone knew one thing: his decision would shape her future more than any punishment students could give. Outside the faculty building, he paused at the staircase, looking out toward the school gate where the incident began. His expression held something unreadable. And as he continued down the steps, it became clear. Whatever he chose next would change everything. He walked across the courtyard with a slow, measured pace, the kind that made students instinctively step aside. His silence trailed behind him like a long shadow stretching across the bricks. No anger, no outburst, no declaration of what he intended to do. Just silence, thick, controlled, deliberate. And somehow, that quietness pressed harder against her chest than any words could. She watched from a distance, hoping to read his thoughts, but his face was a fortress. Every step he took without speaking felt like a countdown, and she didn't know what would happen when the silence finally broke. He paused by the departmental notice board, pretending to check the pinned papers, but his eyes weren't scanning anything. He was thinking, measuring, replaying the moment frame by frame. His posture was almost too still, like someone holding back a storm. Students who passed by sensed the tension around him and lowered their voices. His silence became contagious, an invisible instruction for caution. And though she stood far away, she felt that silence crawling toward her, wrapping around her neck like a cold hand. Nothing terrified her more than the idea that he hadn't reacted, because he was choosing how. Inside his office, he closed the door gently, shutting out the noise of campus life. Papers lay neatly arranged on his desk, but he pushed them aside, unable to focus. He sat down, clasped his hands together, and took a slow breath. Rage flickered in him, brief, sharp, but quickly swallowed by something deeper. Disappointment. He wondered how a student he once praised for discipline could let anger lead her into chaos. He wondered how many people would think he deserved the slap. And he wondered whether silence was protection or the most powerful punishment he could give her. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, refusing to pick up the disciplinary form the officer had left. Filing it would be easy. A signature.
A date.
A brief explanation. And she'd face consequences that could echo for years. But he couldn't bring himself to write her name in ink. Instead, he kept replaying her expression right after she slapped him. How fierce it looked, how quickly it collapsed into fear, how she realized the truth too late. His silence wrestled with his sense of justice, forming a quiet tug-of-war that left him motionless at his desk. He rose slowly and walked toward the window, watching students scatter across the courtyard. He saw her standing alone, shoulders tense, eyes heavy with regret she was trying to hide. For a moment, he felt a strange mix of anger and sadness tug at him. Not because she embarrassed him in public, but because she didn't know how much he had quietly rooted for her in the past. Her essays, her determination, the potential he thought he saw blooming beneath her stubbornness. Now that vision felt bruised. And bruised things always take time to heal, or they break completely. The longer he stood there without acting, the heavier the silence became. It felt like he was holding her future in a closed fist, unsure whether to open it with mercy or squeeze until something cracked. He didn't want to destroy her, but he also couldn't ignore the disrespect. His silence wasn't indecision, it was calculation. Every second, he weighed fairness against consequence, pride against principle. He knew she was suffering already, not from punishment, but from uncertainty. And he knew that sometimes silence can teach lessons louder than any reprimand, leaving the offender to drown in their own thoughts. Finally, he stepped away from the window and reached for his notebook, flipping it open with slow precision. He wrote something, 2 sentences, nothing more, then closed it firmly. The decision wasn't complete, but something inside him had shifted. He picked up his keys, left the office, and walked down the hallway with a new purpose. His silence was no longer floating, now it was moving somewhere, toward something. And as he descended the staircase, the building holding its breath around him, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever he intended next would interrupt her life in ways she wasn't prepared for. She walked away from the courtyard with numb steps, but the shame clinging to her shoulders dragged her backward into old memories she thought she had outgrown. The sunlight on her skin suddenly reminded her of mornings at home when her mother stood in front of the mirror, warning her with tired eyes about the fire she carried inside. That fire once protected her, but today it burned her instead. The echo of her mother's voice rose uninvited, weaving through the school corridors like a ghost she couldn't outrun, whispering warnings she wished she hadn't ignored. The memory sharpened. She was 12 again, standing in their small sitting room as her mother pointed to a shattered plate on the floor. Anger had flung it. Pride had excused it. Her mother's voice trembled with fear, not frustration, as she told her that strength was not in how loud a person reacted, but how well they controlled the storm inside.
She didn't listen then.
She laughed it off. She believed the world would adjust to her fire. But now, walking alone on campus, she realized the world didn't adjust. It punished, and punishment always came when pride was highest. She reached the hallway outside her department and leaned against the wall, pressing her palms against her face. Her mother's words throbbed inside her skull with painful clarity. Your temper will destroy the things your brilliance builds. She always hated that sentence because it felt like a curse. But today, it clung to her chest like truth finally catching up. Students brushed past her, whispering the slap, the video, the drama, and each whisper felt like another reminder that she had repeated the same old mistake, letting anger speak before her mind could breathe. She lifted her head and watched dust dance lazily in a beam of sunlight cutting through the hallway window. Each particle moved with calm, quiet grace, nothing like the chaos inside her. She envied the dust, the stillness of it, the way it floated without fear or judgment. Her mother once told her to move like that, gentle, intentional, peaceful. But she moved like fire, fast, unpredictable, destructive. And now that fire had burned something far bigger than a plate or a childhood argument. It had scorched her future, and the smoke of it was beginning to rise. She slid down the wall slowly, her back hitting the tiles with a soft thud. For the first time that day, tears pricked her eyes, not from embarrassment, but from realization. She could face gossip. She could face murmurs. But she didn't know how to face her mother when all this reached home. She imagined her mother's disappointed sigh, the way her shoulders would drop, the way her eyes would dim. Not from anger, but from heartbreak. And that image tore at her spirit more painfully than any punishment the school could give. Wiping her face quickly, she forced herself to stand. She didn't want to collapse here, in the open, where cameras could catch another moment of vulnerability. She needed air, space, somewhere to gather herself before the weight of her mistake pushed her to the ground. She stepped out toward the open field behind the science block, the wind brushing her face gently, as if trying to cool the heat of regret simmering in her chest. But even the breeze couldn't silence the fear rising inside her, fear that her mother's warning wasn't a prediction, it was destiny. Just as she reached the quiet edge of the field, her phone buzzed sharply in her pocket. One notification. One line. From an unknown number. Report to the administrative office immediately. The words dropped like ice into her veins. She stared at the message, her breath caught halfway in her throat, knowing exactly what it meant. The school was ready to act. And as she turned slowly toward the main building, her mother's warning pulsed in her chest once more, this time not as a memory, but as a prophecy unfolding in real time. She walked toward the administrative block with slow, uneven steps, each one feeling like a countdown echoing inside her chest. The building loomed ahead, tall and glassy, reflecting the sun like a place built to expose the truth. The courtyard beneath her feet felt too wide, too open, as if every student and lecturer could see her fears spilling through her movements. She clutched her phone tightly, the message replaying in her mind like a warning siren. What awaited her behind those doors wasn't a conversation, it was judgment, and the weight of it made her breath tremble. The administrative office was colder than she expected, with bright fluorescent lights that washed every corner in harsh clarity. A receptionist barely looked up before pointing her toward a wooden bench against the wall, the same bench students sat on before facing disciplinary actions. Her legs shook as she sat, the chill from the tiled floor seeping into her bones. Papers shuffled behind closed doors. Low voices murmured. The ticking clock above the notice board sounded louder than necessary. Each second stretched painfully, pressing her deeper into the reality she could no longer escape or rewind. A man in a neat shirt stepped out of the meeting room and called her name, Not loudly, not softly, but with a formal tone that stripped away every excuse she had left. Her heart kicked against her ribs as she stood. The hallway felt too long, too bright, too cruel. She followed him inside, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. The room filled with stern faces, straight backs, and pens poised over paperwork. Seeing her name printed on a file on the table made everything too real. Her mistake wasn't gossip anymore. It was documented, recorded, and waiting to be judged. The disciplinary panel sat like a quiet court, each member representing a different kind of consequence. One lecturer stared at her sharply over his glasses. Another tapped a pen gently, as if measuring her heartbeat. A woman with a calm, unreadable expression watched her closely, observing everything from her breathing to her posture. She felt their eyes move across her like scanners, calculating, evaluating, dissecting the weight of her presence. The room carried a heavy calm, a calm that promised fairness, but demanded accountability. And standing there, she realized that pride had no place in spaces like this. A tablet was placed on the table, and when they tapped play, the slap echoed through the speakers with brutal clarity. She flinched. Even the panel members shifted slightly. The video played from multiple angles. Students had captured everything. Her hand, his face, the shock, the crowd. Nothing could be denied. The room swallowed her whole as the footage repeated, each replay digging deeper into the wound she created. She wanted to disappear into her own shadow, but shadows couldn't hide what screens had already exposed. And when the video stopped, the silence that followed felt like a steep drop. A woman at the far end of the table leaned forward and asked the one question she wasn't ready for. "Why did you hit him?" Her throat tightened instantly. Words tried to form but fell apart as soon as they reached her tongue. The anger she felt earlier seemed childish now, unjustifiable, reckless. She knew explanations wouldn't erase what everyone had seen. She opened her mouth, hoping for something coherent to come out, but guilt pressed down on her, stealing her voice. And the longer she remained silent, the more the question echoed inside her, demanding an answer. The panel exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable, their pens scratching faintly against paper. Decisions were forming quietly, carefully. Decisions that could ripple through her future in ways she wasn't prepared to face. She stood frozen, her palms damp, her heartbeat trembling in her ears as they reviewed her file once more. The room felt like it was closing in inch by inch. Finally, the chairman lifted his head and cleared his throat, signaling the beginning of something irreversible. And as his eyes locked onto hers, she felt her knees weaken. The penalty for her moment of anger was finally arriving. She stepped out of the disciplinary office feeling like she had left a piece of herself behind. The hallway felt colder now, every fluorescent light harsher, every footstep echoing like a reminder that she was no longer just another student. She walked past the administrative block numb and shaky, clutching the strap of her bag as if it were the only thing anchoring her. She scanned the courtyard desperately for a familiar face, someone who would walk beside her, someone who would reassure her. But when she saw her friends in the distance, their expressions struck her harder than the panel's questions. Two of her closest friends stood near the faculty garden, scrolling through their phones with a mix of shock and amusement. When they saw her approaching, they didn't wave. They didn't smile. They exchanged quick, uneasy glances as if her presence had suddenly complicated their comfort. She expected them to rush toward her, to ask if she was okay, to whisper support. Instead, their eyes darted around nervously, checking who might be watching, who might associate them with her. Their hesitation stung more sharply than the slap had sounded. Loyalty, she realized, was quiet until tested. She took a slow step toward them, forcing a small, hopeful smile that faltered halfway. Her friends shifted uneasily, their hands tightening around their phones, their bodies leaning slightly away. One cleared her throat. The other adjusted her bag strap. None of them moved closer. The distance between them suddenly felt like a wide canyon, dug deeper by gossip, fear, and self-preservation. She felt her chest tighten, realizing she wasn't just facing disciplinary action, she was losing her circle. The sting of isolation crept up her spine, sharper and colder than any official punishment she had feared. As she stood there, a group of students walked past, whispering behind cupped palms. Her friends noticed the whispers immediately and stepped even farther back, pretending to be deeply engaged in whatever was on their screens. The message was silent but brutal. You're on your own. She felt it in the way they avoided eye contact, the way their shoulders stiffened, the way they behaved like being close to her could tarnish them too. Shame was contagious, and they didn't want to catch it. Her heart began to ache with a new kind of hurt, the hurt of seeing who was real. One of her friends finally looked up, but instead of warmth, her eyes held caution. She gave a tight, strained smile, the kind people offer when they want to appear kind without actually stepping forward. Then she checked the courtyard again, scanning for witnesses, as if offering comfort would be a stain on her record. The other girl shifted uncomfortably and muttered something that sounded like an excuse before taking a small step back. They weren't openly rejecting her, but they were slipping away in tiny, careful movements. And somehow that quiet betrayal cut deeper than open abandonment. She stepped back, letting the truth settle into her bones. She wasn't just dealing with a lecturer's silence or a panel's judgment. She was dealing with a loneliness she hadn't expected. She watched her friends whisper to each other, avoiding her eyes, rearranging their bags like they needed something to do with their hands. They were nervous, uncomfortable, almost guilty, but not enough to stand beside her. She felt something inside her crumble gently, quietly. People didn't have to leave loudly to show they were gone. Sometimes they drifted away 1 inch at a time, and you felt every inch. Just as she turned away from them, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't the school administration. It wasn't an unknown number. It was her class representative. 1 line. 1 sentence. You need to come to the department immediately. It's urgent. Her breath hitched. She didn't know if it meant another meeting, another warning, or a new consequence. But the urgency in the message sent a fresh wave of dread rushing through her veins. She looked back at her fading friends one last time, then walked toward the department, every step carrying her closer to another unknown storm. She walked toward the department building with a tightness in her chest, each step heavy with the weight of new consequences she wasn't ready to meet. The hallway was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that felt intentional, as if everything and everyone had paused to watch her fate unfold. The class rep stood by the door, eyes avoiding hers, face pale with something that looked like discomfort rather than sympathy. He didn't speak. He simply gestured toward the office ahead. Her pulse surged. Another meeting? Another punishment? But the tone in his body told her this was something different. Something personal. She stepped into the head of department's office, feeling the air thicken around her. Academic files lined the shelves, and a faint scent of old books hung in the room. The HOD didn't look angry, just deeply thoughtful. He motioned for her to sit, and the chair beneath her felt too soft, too quiet, too fragile for the storm inside her. He studied her silently for a moment, then opened a drawer and pulled out a neatly arranged file. It wasn't the disciplinary one. It was something else. Something with her name attached to it in an unexpected way. The HOD slid the file toward her, and when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside were printed emails, handwritten notes, and performance reviews, all about her. Positive ones. Detailed ones. Consistent ones. All written by the lecturer she slapped. He had been recommending her for an upcoming scholarship program. He had praised her discipline, her writing strength, her consistency. He had defended her in academic meetings. He had insisted she had leadership potential. Each page felt like a stab. She realized she hadn't just slapped a lecturer, she had slapped the one person quietly invested in her success. She flipped through page after page, her eyes stinging. There were notes about her essays, comments about her potential, even copies of forms he had partially filled for her scholarship submission. The HOD explained in a calm, heavy voice that the lecturer had spoken of her with unusual respect, calling her a student who could rise far if given the right direction. Her fingers trembled as she held the documents. The truth settled like a weight in her lungs. He wasn't her enemy. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone who wanted to fail her. He was someone who believed in her. Her vision blurred as guilt wrapped itself around her like tight rope. She remembered his calm eyes after the slap, the disappointment beneath them, the restraint he maintained. She had interpreted it as silent punishment. But now she saw it for what it truly was: heartbreak. He had invested time, thought, and advocacy into her growth, only to be met with public humiliation. She pressed a shaky hand against her chest, trying to hold herself together, but the betrayal she felt toward herself was stronger than anything the school could inflict. She had destroyed trust she never even knew existed. The HOD cleared his throat softly, bringing her back into the moment. He told her the lecturer had refused to submit a complaint. Not because he wasn't hurt, but because he didn't want to jeopardize her future. He had chosen silence, not out of indifference, but out of protection. His silence wasn't the storm she feared. It was a shield she didn't deserve. And hearing that broke her in a different way. How do you repay someone who chooses mercy when you give them humiliation? How do you fix something you shattered with your own hands? Just as she gathered the strength to breathe again, the HOD reached into his drawer and pulled out a second file, thinner, darker, more official. He placed it gently on the table. "This," he said quietly, "is the pending report the school asked him to complete." She stared at it, her heart slamming painfully against her ribs. The lecturer hadn't signed it yet. The panel was waiting. The entire administration was waiting. And now, with the truth laid bare before her, she realized she had one last chance to change the ending of her story, if she could face him. She stepped out of the HOD's office with her heart pounding hard enough to shake her steps. The scholarship file pressed against her palm felt heavier than a textbook, heavier than all her mistakes combined. She scanned the campus urgently, hallways, balconies, walkways, looking for the man she had wronged. Students moved around her like a river she couldn't join, each one unaware that she was carrying a truth so painful it felt like a bruise spreading through her chest. She needed to find him. She needed to speak before the silence between them hardened into something permanent. She finally saw him outside the science block, standing beneath a tree, reviewing a stack of papers with calm, meticulous focus. The sight of him sent a tremor through her body. He looked untouched by the chaos surrounding her, even serene. For a moment, she hesitated, afraid to break that calm with her guilt. The wind carried a faint rustle of leaves, brushing against her skin like a reminder that this was her only chance. She took a step forward, then another, her breath catching as she approached the man whose silence carried both mercy and heartbreak. Her voice broke before she even reached him, her words tangled in her chest like vines. She stood in front of him, trembling, clutching the file as if it could shield her from the weight of her mistake. The world around them softened into a blur. Students walking, birds chirping, a distant car horn, but none of it mattered. She forced the apology out, each word heavy, raw, desperate. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't pride. It was the truth spilling out from a heart cracked open. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't enough. He listened quietly, his eyes steady and unreadable. He didn't wince. He didn't nod. He didn't soften. His calmness felt like a mirror she wasn't ready to look into. The apology hung between them, suspended in the quiet air, waiting for acceptance that didn't come. He simply watched her, studying her face like someone searching for sincerity, not in her words, but in her posture, her breathing, the tiny tremble in her voice. His silence wasn't cruel. It was measured. But its lack of warmth struck her like cold water, reminding her that forgiveness doesn't come on demand. He looked away briefly, as if collecting thoughts scattered by the wind. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost too calm for the weight of the moment. He acknowledged hearing her apology, but his words didn't offer comfort. They didn't absolve her. He didn't scold, but he also didn't soothe. Instead, he reminded her, quietly, that actions have consequences and apologies don't erase the impact of harm. His tone carried no anger, yet each syllable pressed firmly against her heart. She felt small, exposed, ashamed. His response wasn't rejection, but it wasn't forgiveness either. She stood there, feeling her throat tighten as his words settled inside her. Her apology had been sincere, but sincerity couldn't undo the public humiliation she caused. She realized forgiveness wasn't just about admitting wrong, it was about rebuilding something broken, piece by fragile piece. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she blinked them back, not wanting to make the moment heavier. She wished she could go back in time, stop herself, protect the version of her he once believed in. But the past sat between them like a wall, and climbing it would take more than words. He closed his file and took a slow breath, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, tired, wise, disappointed, but not hateful. He told her the disciplinary board was still reviewing the case, and his decision would influence the outcome. That alone made her knees weaken. Then he stepped past her, not dismissively but deliberately, leaving a space where forgiveness might eventually grow. He didn't promise mercy. He didn't promise punishment. He simply walked away, carrying the final power in his silence. And as she watched him go, she realized her apology was only the beginning. Exam morning arrived with a strange, heavy quietness that settled across campus, like a warning cloud. Students hurried into the hall clutching pens, calculators, and last-minute notes, but she walked slowly, each step dragging a knot of dread behind her. The slap, the panel, the silence, the apology. Everything swirled inside her chest like a storm refusing to rest. She held her ID card with trembling fingers, forcing herself through the doors. The cold air of the hall wrapped around her instantly, sharpening her senses. She thought she was prepared for the test, until her eyes landed on the invigilators. He entered the hall with a stack of answer booklets tucked neatly under his arm. His steps were steady, unhurried, carrying the quiet authority that made every student sit straighter. Her breath caught. Of all invigilators, why him? The lecturer she slapped was now the one supervising her exam. His presence felt like an invisible spotlight burning into her back. She lowered her gaze, hoping he wouldn't notice the way her hand shook. But karma had already taken its seat beside her, whispering a truth she couldn't escape. Sometimes consequences don't shout. They walk into the room wearing a tie. He began handing out answer booklets row by row, his movements calm, precise. When he reached her desk, she kept her eyes glued to the surface, afraid that looking up would unravel what little strength she still had. The booklet touched her desk gently, but the moment felt heavier than a drop of stone. She felt his presence pause. Just for a breath, just long enough to tighten the air around her, before he moved on. That brief hesitation was a reminder. He remembered everything. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she opened the booklet, already imagining the future written inside. The question stared back at her, familiar, yet suddenly terrifying. Topics she once understood clearly now blurred into a fog of panic. Her mind, usually sharp during exams, felt heavy and sluggish. Every sentence she tried to form collapsed halfway. She could hear pens scratching across desks as others wrote confidently, while she sat frozen, unable to steady her breathing. Her thoughts kept drifting to him, his calm eyes, his silence, the scholarship file, the unsent complaint. She felt trapped between guilt and fear, knowing the marks he would later assign could either break her or offer a reluctant second chance. Minutes ticked by, and pressure wrapped around her like a tightening rope. She scribbled a few lines, then crossed them out. Tried again. Failed again. Her chest heaved with frustration as the reality settled. She wasn't battling the questions. She was battling herself. Camera flashes from outside the hall echoed faintly in her memory. Her friend's avoidance replayed painfully. The disciplinary panel's faces hovered like shadows around her. And beneath it all was his silence, the silence that judged without speaking. Every mark she wrote felt like a plea for redemption, a request for mercy she wasn't sure she deserved. Halfway through the exam, she sensed him standing behind her row. His steps were quiet, but the air shifted when he paused near her desk. She didn't dare look up, but she felt the weight of his gaze scanning her work. It wasn't cruelty. It was evaluation. He was seeing more than her handwriting. He was seeing the consequences of a shaken mind. After a long, breathless moment, he moved away, leaving her pulse thundering against her ribs. His silence was louder inside the exam hall, echoing in her thoughts as she realized that grades could become the final truth-teller. When time was called, she felt her spirit collapse. She handed in the script with trembling fingers, watching him collect each paper carefully, stacking them with the same precision he showed in everything he did. When he reached hers, he paused again, just for a fraction of a second, before placing it on top of the pile. That tiny moment sent a sharp chill through her body. He would read every word she wrote. He would see every mistake. And whatever judgment he delivered next would shape not just her grade, but her fate. Karma wasn't coming anymore. It had arrived. Days passed like slow-moving storms, each one carrying a new wave of anxiety that settled deep in her stomach. She checked her department's notice board every morning, pretending to scan for announcements while secretly searching for the one thing that terrified her most: exam scores. Sleep didn't come easily. Guilt kept replaying the slap, the silence, the disappointment. Everywhere she walked, whispers trailed her like shadows. She felt suspended between two outcomes: mercy or ruin. And each hour that passed without results felt like the world holding its breath, waiting to reveal whether she would rise from her mistake or fall deeper. One morning, a crowd gathered around the board. Students whispered, pointed, laughed, groaned. Her heart hammered as she pushed through them, breath shallow and unsteady. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the list. Then she saw it, her score. It wasn't excellent. It wasn't failing either. It was a pass. A fragile, borderline pass that felt like a rope thrown to someone drowning. Relief punched through her chest, sharp enough to steal her breath. He hadn't destroyed her future, but he also hadn't rewarded her. The message was clear. This was mercy, not victory. And mercy always demands growth. She turned away from the board and saw him standing a short distance away, speaking quietly with another lecturer. His posture was as calm as ever, his presence steady, controlled. When his eyes lifted and met hers, time thinned into silence. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. But he didn't look away either. That steady gaze held something different, neither anger nor disappointment. It held expectation, accountability, a silent challenge to become better than the version of herself that had struck him. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, not comfort, but realization. She had been given another chance. She stepped outside the building, letting the sun warm her skin as a soft breeze brushed through her hair. For the first time since the incident, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Not because everything was fixed, but because she finally accepted the truth. Growth sometimes begins in the ashes of your own mistakes. She realized her mother's warnings weren't meant to scold her. They were meant to protect her from exactly this kind of downfall. And now, standing between regret and renewal, she felt something unfamiliar but grounding: humility, the kind that didn't break her, but rebuilt her. She walked slowly across the campus, noticing things she once overlooked: students hurrying between lectures, the sound of chalk scraping against boards, the scent of new books drifting from the library. These ordinary things suddenly felt precious. She understood now that her education wasn't just a right, it was a privilege. And every lecturer, every class, every opportunity demanded respect she hadn't always given. She promised herself that the fire inside her would no longer burn recklessly. It would be controlled, focused, directed toward becoming someone worthy of the faith she had once unknowingly received. As she walked past the faculty garden, she paused, watching flowers sway gently in the breeze. They reminded her that growth wasn't instant. It was patient, silent, steady. She knew students would still whisper when she passed. She knew some friendships wouldn't return. But she also knew something else. Her story didn't end with a slap. It began after it. Every step forward would be a lesson. Every decision would be weighed differently. Her pride had cost her dignity, relationships, and peace. But humility offered her a new path, one she was finally ready to walk without anger leading the way. She reached the gate where everything began, the place still holding the echo of her mistake. But this time, she didn't feel fear. She felt clarity. The gate was no longer a reminder of shame. It was a reminder of who she refused to be again. As she stepped out, her phone buzzed. A message from the lecturer. 2 words. Keep growing. Her breath caught, not from fear, but from hope. Mercy hadn't wiped her slate clean. Mercy had handed her a pen. And now, with steady steps and a humble